Everybody, and welcome to the continuation of ICON's Facebook Live series. Today is the 20th of May, which is International Clinical Trials Day. And hence we're going to be bringing you our Facebook Live with a fantastic panel talking about clinical trials and answering your questions that you have on this topic. You might ask why International Clinical Trial Day is on the 20th of May. And the reason is that it was on this day back in 1747 when James Lind commenced his trial on the treatment of scurvy. It had a control group, and the way the trial was conducted, although in some ways very different to how we conduct our clinical trials today, is thought to be the first randomized controlled trial that was undertaken throughout the world. For those of you who don't know me from our other Facebook Live events, Dr. Ian Irving is my name. I'm proud enough to be ICON's medical director, and I'm also a practicing haematologist at ICON Wesley in Brisbane. Cancer care has improved enormously over the last 50 years, and much of the reason for this improvement has been through clinical trials and both clinical and laboratory research. Without clinical trials and without research, the field does not progress, and results of treating cancer would not improve. So tonight we have three speakers. We're going to start the evening with each speaker giving a 5-minute introduction to the area that they are going to talk about. And then after our initial presentations, we'll go into the question and answer section for the evening and answer the questions that you have pre-submitted, but also very happy to take questions live. And so please, as you're watching the Facebook event tonight, put your questions through the chat room and they'll be put to our three experts. So we'll go very much into our first presentation now. We've got Dr. John Bashford, who's ICON's Director of Research. John has been a practicing haematologist and medical oncologist until very recently, over the last few years, stepping in to this academic and administrative role after decades of clinical practice. John's going to give us a brief overview of some of the highlights of progress in cancer medicine over the last 30 years during his career. And he's going to talk about some of the topical issues that relate to clinical trials in the present day. Our other speakers, Associate Professor Jim Coward and Dr. Sophie Mepham, who's joining us from ICON in Hobart. I'll introduce prior to their presentation, but John has been a tireless advocate for research for many years and has joined us on a few of these Facebook Lives talking about COVID-19 and other aspects of medical care during the present. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce John for our first presentation for the evening. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Ian. First of all, you've answered a great question for me, the link between sailing and clinical research. But it's also a terrific example of how a clinical trial can change the world, because the advent of safe sea travel and the ability to explore across oceans was greatly impacted by this clinical trial, and so that that has immediate impact upon the history of mankind. So I think it's a good example, and I've been involved in clinical trials on a far more localized basis around the area of cancer medicine now for over 40 years. 2020, of course, was an absolutely unprecedented year. It was a challenging year for clinical trials, and I know with Ian and I, we did a number of webcasts around COVID-19 and its impacts, and we were very aware of the fears in all sorts of all sorts of ways. But in clinical trials, we were concerned that they would stop, that clinical trials would dry up, that patients would find it difficult to participate. But I think what we've really found in COVID, and what we found in our group, but in communities around the country and around the world, is that our teams adapted rapidly. They were very committed to change. They found new ways of using technology, new ways of doing trials. And in many ways, we made advances that we've been talking about for 10 years in terms of communication. So I think it's been a time of re-evaluation and rebuilding, both for us at ICON Research, but across research in general. And I think that'll have a big impact in the future. It certainly will improve the ability for trials to be taken into communities and for people to be treated closer to home. So I think there's a lot of optimism now around the things that we've learnt. I think secondly, I'd like to say that vaccines represent a great example. COVID's taught us the value of clinical trials on a very big scale. We've seen in a short period of time the basic science go from laboratory into patients in clinical trials, and now to the bedside and directly to us all. And it's a great example of really the need to do clinical trials, because we've been able to find out which vaccines work well, what the side effects are, understand the side effects, and really choose the ones that matter. We've seen some fall by the wayside, some have been very successful. And that really is the story of clinical trials. And it will have a huge impact. We're seeing in the United Kingdom and in Israel a great drop. There were no deaths recently on a daily basis in the UK, and that is very much vaccine related. So if you need a good example, that's a really good example. For me, I've seen many changes over my career. I think we're very much in the middle of an immunotherapy revolution. And again, that's been a basic science to the clinic example over 25 to 30 years. But now we're seeing real advances, and we're seeing those in the clinics, and we're seeing significant changes. And there are a whole variety of different ways of modifying the immune system, and Dr. Coward will certainly talk to some of those. But I think that's really the big group of advances that we're seeing in cancer care. But there are many others. Radiotherapy, in this job I'm learning a lot about radiotherapy that I didn't know before, and certainly the ability to improve the precision and the effectiveness of radiotherapy, decrease the side effects, has been really very impressive, and continued development there is very important, and clinical trials play an essential role. The other area that I'm had quite a passion for is supportive care, and I think we have seen a really significant improvement in the number and quality of trials around things like exercise, nutrition, diet in general, and meditation, psychological assistance, things that people have thought perhaps are a bit soft, but in fact have had a really significant impact. And I think that's an important trend, because again, ultimately, if we're going to pay for complex services, and even doing simple exercise has a cost, we need to know it's effective. And I just go back to the vaccine story. We've recently seen a HIV vaccine that had great hopes, for which there's a negative trial. So that makes it very easy to say, look, we need to go in a different direction. So clinical trials, for me, they're the way of leading us into the future. From the limeys of the 18th century to now, they inform what will be the best practice tomorrow. And so I'm a very strong advocate for that, and I know our team has got a great ability to assist our patients to be involved in those trials.
Thank you, John, for that excellent introduction. And it seems a world ago now when COVID was first upon us, but clinical trials have certainly continued on. We'll come back. Well, there'll be many questions that I know for you, John, as the night unfolds. But it gives me great pleasure at the moment to introduce our second speaker, Associate Professor Jim Coward. Now, Jim is a medical oncologist with a very strong interest in research, who works at ICON Cancer Centre in South Brisbane, co-located with the Mater Hospital, and also at Icon Cancer Centre in Chermside. Jim has a distinguished career in research, particularly in phase 1 trials, and Jim is Icon's clinical lead for our phase 1 trial program. Jim's going to demystify for us tonight what some of the language that is used around clinical trials means. So he's going to explain for us all what is a phase 1 trial, what is a phase 2 trial, a phase 3 trial, and go over with us when, as a patient or as a treating clinician, you should look to enrol someone in a clinical trial to help improve their outcome. So once again, on behalf of everyone watching, Jim, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us tonight on International Clinical Trials Day on Facebook. It's a real pleasure to have the chance to talk to you and, as Ian said, demystify various ideas about clinical trials. So as Ian said, I had the pleasure of leading Icon's phase 1 unit. So what does phase 1 mean? Well, exactly what it says. It's the first phase of drug development. So what usually happens is we have tumours which are investigated within animal models, whether it be mice, whether it be monkeys, rats, etc. And we find out that from the scientists that there are particular drugs which can be used in these mice and have activity in particular diseases. Then the first phase then is to actually find out, are these particular drugs actually safe to use within patients? So phase 1 is about safety primarily. So how it works is that we start off with quite a low dose, which is worked out by various calculations in just a handful of patients. So it's usually 3 patients. Then there is a meeting to assess the particular side effects and to make a decision as to whether it is safe to go to another dose. Further patients are then enrolled at those particular doses, and so on and so forth, until we get to a maximum tolerated dose of a particular drug. Now, at that stage, there is a decision made on that dose being taken forward to a phase 2 trial. Phase 2 trial is all about seeing if the drug is effective. Although this is something we also investigate within the phase 1, but phase 2 is primarily to see if that particular dose of that drug in numerous tumour types is particularly effective in a far broader number of patients. Then we find out about the efficacy, and then this leads to the next phase. The most exciting phase, I think, is this particular drug better than the standard of care? So the treatment which is used daily for a particular disease. Now, at that stage, we then find out whether that particular drug or a combination of that drug with standard of care is better than standard of care, whether that is superior with regard to efficacy and survival. Then a decision is made as to whether that becomes the new standard of care. So you can see from that journey that phase 1 is really the foundation of drug development. Now, I guess it's probably best now to give you some examples of the success that we've seen with these individual phases. So with phase 1, we've seen more recently in ovarian cancer, which has a real potential for when in stages of relapse, for metastasizing, so spreading to the abdomen. We usually give chemotherapy via a vein, so intravenously, but there's been new evidence to show that if you give a particular treatment within the abdomen directly to treat cells which are resistant to chemotherapy, patients who have had evidence of poor prognosis can actually gain far superior response than what we've seen historically with chemotherapy. Then going on to phase 2, we're seeing that patients are having much better response with regard to endometrial cancer, for example, when you're combining immunotherapy, which we'll talk about later, with drugs which target blood vessel development. And then phase 3, we've seen more recently diseases with very poor prognosis, such as small cell lung cancer. We're finding that there is significant improvement in survival when you combine chemotherapy with immunotherapy. So great examples of amazing studies which have been done, which have really enhanced patient survival.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim, for clarifying for all of us the different phases of clinical trial that are offered. Our third speaker from tonight is actually joining us from ICON Hobart. Sophie Mepham, Dr. Sophie Mepham is ICON's Executive Manager of Research. She's based both in Melbourne and Brisbane, but travels extensively around ICON's network of 31 cancer centres throughout the country to manage and supervise our clinical trial program. So we're very thankful to have Sophie with us tonight. Sophie's got an extensive background in clinical trials, both in Australia and in the UK. And Sophie is going to explain to us why it is she got involved in clinical trial work, what she finds fascinating about research, and also go over for everyone the sort of team that is needed to run clinical trials, and describe how she manages that team at ICON for the betterment of all of our patients. So, Sophie, thank you very much for joining us, I believe, on your vacation. We're delighted to have you and very much interested in what you have to say.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you for that introduction. I am on vacation, but International Clinical Trials Day is the most important day of the year for me and for my team and for the patients around the world that take part in the trials that ICON and multiple other groups around the world run on a daily basis. So thank you for inviting me. I think just to set a little bit of context, clinical trials are incredibly important to me personally. My mum was actually diagnosed with breast cancer over 25 years ago. I was at university at the time studying a degree in biology, and I had to leave university for a few months to support my mum through that time. And she was actually treated on a clinical trial. And from that moment on, I knew that was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So my career was well and truly chosen halfway through that degree. And I think for me, I've seen the absolute benefit of clinical trials firsthand. My mum did extremely well. She's alive, she's well, she's extremely well from that diagnosis. And if we think how much treatment has advanced for breast cancer in the last 10 years, to see that my mum has done so well from a clinical trial that was running over 25 years ago is really testament for me personally around why clinical trials are so important. So a little bit about the role that I do here at ICON. I look after a really big team of people. So we've got over 40 staff that are dedicated to the operational side of running clinical trials. Clinical trials are very highly regulated, and there are very strict guidelines and standards that we have to follow every single day. It starts with independent ethics review of our clinical trials. And as such, we have a dedicated team of people who literally are just responsible for making sure that all of the clinical trials that our doctors want to run are set up properly, that they have an independent ethics review, and all of the processes and all of the documents that we need to have in place to ensure that our patients are safe are there. Things like, do we have the right insurance policies? Do we have the ethics approval? Have all of the documents been double and triple checked? It's a really quite a lengthy process that we have to go through to make sure that a trial is really safe and really high quality before we open it at one of our ICON centres. So we have teams across multiple ICON cancer centres here in Australia, and we've also just launched a clinical trial program in Singapore, and we're about to launch in Hong Kong. So we have about 150 clinical trials running at ICON at any one time, and we run them across phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and some phase 4 studies. And we also run multiple different types of trials. And while I'm describing what happens here at ICON, this will be very similar to any large medical organization or hospital that runs clinical trials. So we will run trials that doctors here at ICON have designed. They've been working closely with patients, and they want to explore something that is really important to the treatment or the outcomes for our patients. We also run clinical trials directly with pharmaceutical companies. So they find the new drug and they come to us, and we make sure that those trials are run really well. But we also work with other groups. So melanoma and skin cancer trials, the Trans-Tasman Radiation Oncology Group, breast cancer trials. And we run groups, they come to us with their trials, and we also run those directly and offer them as potential opportunities for our patients. So I think it's about the operational side. Our job is to support the doctors and make sure that all of those trials run to really high standards. So we have about 40 staff, and those staff support around about 80 doctors to run those clinical trials. So as well as getting the clinical trials open, we also have clinical research coordinators who work very closely with the doctors at a site. They help patients through that journey. They make sure all of their tests have been booked. They make sure that they're getting the patients all of the tests and the follow-ups that they need. But they also collect the data, which is a really important part of the clinical trial process. That data is collected, and all of the patients around the world who are taking part in that trial, their data is collected, and it all comes together with whoever's responsible for that study. So operationally, it is a really big role. It's a role I passionately enjoy. I've been doing this role for 25 years now. Can't imagine ever doing anything different. So it's a privilege to be part of the ICON group, but also part of a global community of researchers who every day make a difference to the medicines for tomorrow. So thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Sophie, for that great introduction. So this brings us all to the interactive part of the evening, where we'd love you to put questions to our panelists through the Facebook comments section. We do have a number of questions that audience members have put forward ahead of time, so we'll get started with some of those questions that have been put forward before we've gone to air tonight. But we'd very much love you to put your questions in the comments section so we can put them to our panelists. Now, in both John and Jim's introduction, mention was made of immunotherapy, and it certainly has been one of the changes that have occurred in cancer care is the development of immunotherapy. John, could you start off with maybe explaining to us why does immunotherapy work in some patients but doesn't in others?
I suppose the first question is, why does the immunotherapy work at all? And it works because our bodies do have a way of recognizing many cancer cells as foreign. And so the same as we fight off a virus, then we should theoretically be able to fight off a cancer. But equally, the cancer cell and the body have lots of ways of switching off that immune response. The modern therapies have taught us how to turn that on again. And I think, like so many things in nature, there's never just one system, one way of a system working. Nature protects us by having lots of backup systems. So in many ways, this is a young field. I can remember attending meetings in 2015 when the really important results started to come through. And at that stage, we were very excited. But what's become really apparent, and Jim can speak to this better than I can in terms of detail, is that there are many pathways that are disturbed in a cancer patient. And we're learning the major one. We're learning some of the others. But I think this will be an unfolding story. And as I said in my introduction, I think this will go on for many years. So learning which pathways are important is the key here, I think.
Yes,
Jim,
absolutely. And just touching on sort of the modern approach to immunotherapy, I mean, this has been around for decades, but at the moment we're really focusing on something called immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy. So immune checkpoints are a natural way in which we can regulate our immunity. So what the cancer does, it's very clever. It adopts those same mechanisms in order to evade anti-tumor immunity, so the ability for the body to actually eradicate the cancer. So manipulating that, there have been a number of different antibodies which will block these immune checkpoints. And we found that in certain diseases, it has absolutely been a game changer in the way that patients have been surviving. So for example, melanomas is the poster child for this. Not that long ago when I was a junior doctor, well, actually quite some time ago when I was a junior doctor.
Shorter than for me.
Chemotherapy was a mainstay for melanoma, and the response rate was 7%. Then we found out that by using immunotherapy, a combination of immunotherapies, in fact, which is now a standard of care, we now have patients with metastatic disease where they are living, more than half of patients are now living 4 to 5 years. Quite incredible. And we found out very similar results in certain types of lung cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, which is now a standard of care, and also certain types of breast cancer. But there are those tumor types out there where this doesn't work. There are some tumor types where they don't express these proteins. So trying to use immune checkpoints for those particular diseases is not going to work. You may actually get those proteins, but the cell itself, the tumor cell, doesn't have the immune cells in order to actually combat the cancer. So now we're looking at various ways of combining these immune checkpoints with various drugs to actually enhance the tumor cells to actually enrich the cancer cells to get a response.
Fascinating. Thank you, John and Jim. Can I follow up with you, Jim, when you were talking about immunotherapy for different types of cancer? And this goes to a question from Margaret, who's asking if there are any trials underway of immunotherapy in ovarian cancer.
Yes, great question, Margaret, because ovarian cancer is actually my favourite topic. Now, the problem with ovarian cancer is the environment, so the microscopic environment of this disease is what's known as very immunosuppressive. And what we found out is that there are a number of different proteins which actually suppress anti-tumor immunity. And this is the reason why it's not really working. So what we've actually found recently is you can enhance the anti-tumor immunity by combining these immune checkpoints, as I described earlier, with other drugs which have activity in ovarian cancer. And one in particular is a drug called Avastin. And we've actually been investigating a number of different ways of trying to target tumor blood vessel development, which is what Avastin does. We've used various approaches to do that in combination with immunotherapy, particularly in patients who have poor prognostic ovarian cancer, so something called platinum-resistant disease. We're now finding that these patients who had a response rate of around about 10% with chemo, we're getting response rates of 30%, even more, and durable responses as well. So those trials are out there, and there is actually more to do.
No, thank you, Jim. That's a lot of food for thought. And just when you mention that about there being a lot out there, I mean, we know that over the last few decades, you know, since the internet came along, and there's information overload for all of us. But I wonder, Sophie, if you would be able to give us a little bit of an explanation and some tips for everyone watching on what is the best way to search for information about clinical trials? How does a patient find the right clinical trial for them?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's a really great question, and I can see there's a lot of people asking about how they find out about particular trials. Australia actually has 2 or 3 really good websites that are independent, that allow patients to search specifically for the type of cancer that they have, or for an area that they live in, to see what trials might be available. And these websites will tell you all of the trials that are available in all of the possible medical organizations or hospitals, so that people can make a decision about where they may like to go. So one of the first places that patients can look is the Cancer Council website. They have a really great service online where you can actually type in the type of cancer that you have, or that someone in your family has, and will tell you the answers to where a trial may be available. Another really good website is the Australian Cancer Trials website, and also a really great website called ClinTrial Refer. And that is a site that has been specifically set up for doctors and for patients to allow them to search. So those are 3 independent websites that will tell you all of the trials available in all of the hospitals across Australia. For patients who are being treated at ICON, we actually have our own website, and patients can actually go onto the website and search all of the different trials that we have available here at ICON. But we are also listing all of our trials on those other websites as well. I think in addition, if you have a particular cancer type and you want to search, you can actually go to some of the specific groups that support patients with that type of cancer. So for instance, Melanoma and Skin Cancer Australia, Rare Cancers Australia, Breast Cancer Network Australia, they will actually also be able to help you with specific trials in those specific areas. So there is actually a really good selection of places that patients can search independently to find a trial that might be right for them.
Well, thank you, Sophie. And I think you've given a lot of real practical hints there to people watching, and your shout out there to Rare Cancers Australia, I certainly would echo. I mean, Richard Vines has done a fantastic job in bringing focus to rare cancers that by their very nature only affect a small number of patients in Australia, but are of course equally important. Mentions was made by Sophie about searching for different clinical trials, John. Can you maybe expand on what Sophie has said and give some advice to our audience on how do people find a reputable trial that uses natural therapies or alternative therapies instead of chemotherapy and radiation?
Look, I think it's a very important question, Ian, and certainly here on International Clinical Trials Day, the first principle that I think we espouse is that everyone has a right to be involved in a clinical trial. But the balance of that, of course, is that there is not a clinical trial for every opportunity, and many clinical trials are very specific as to who can be on them and the nature of their cancer, etc. So you have to match those things up. The natural therapy area is an interesting one because, as I said in my introduction, I think we've seen a lot of expansion of trials around a variety of what we broadly call supportive care, which falls into that natural therapy space. But natural therapy often has another meaning too, and that's around various compounds which are claimed to have anti-cancer activity, which are used by almost all patients. Will use one so complementary or natural therapy along the way, and there are difficulties with some of those. Many of them are not regulated by the Therapeutics Goods Association, so there is no need for them to prove their benefit. It's expensive to do a clinical trial, and so many of these things come in on budgets that don't allow for those trials to be done, and there's no commercial need for people to do them. So it can be quite difficult. And with that goes the concern then that do these things work? And I think it goes back to that first principle around the trials in scurvy, that unless you ask the question and do the trial, you never really know. So I think it's a great need for them. There's not enough of them. And as I've said, there are commercial reasons why that's so. But I think where there's an opportunity, I think search for the area that you're interested in. The internet is a great way through that, and certainly we encourage things that people say work. We encourage studying them to see whether they do.
Sure. Yeah, a good follow-up question for you though, John, around exercise. The use of exercise is very close to your heart. I think you're involved in many of the initial studies of trialing exercise together with anti-cancer therapies. Are there still trials ongoing that deal with exercise and cancer?
Certainly are. It's an area of great study, and as you say, I'm proud to say I was associated with somebody who did a PhD with us many years ago now in the bone marrow transplant unit, and there was very little activity in that area, and we were able to show that it has a positive effect on recovery after bone marrow transplant, and that individual, Dr. Sandy Hayes, has gone on as a professor in exercise physiology to a very distinguished career and is still very actively involved. There are a number of researchers around the country and also in a number of networks. And I think there's a very consistent message that exercise does improve people's ability to get better initially after chemotherapy. And there's some good evidence in a number of settings that you may actually improve the survival. So I think as we find with exercise in so many areas, there's a positive benefit. But I think that the simplest thing is that key ability to get going again and recover, which is so important in cancer therapy.
I'd like to add to that, actually, especially with regard to immunotherapy. This is something I do mention to my patients, that exercise is actually poor man's immunotherapy. There's been preclinical evidence, again, going back to mice, where you will have experiments with mice being injected with tumours, set of mice with a treadmill, been fed really good nutritious food, and those mice fed terrible food and no treadmill. And the mice which were then euthanized at the end of a period of 8 weeks, the tumours were retrieved, and the tumours were teeming full of immune cells. And those tumours were actually far smaller than those mice who weren't exercising. So this is the reason why I say to my patients, get out there, even just long walks or a bit of a run, even once a week is better than being sedentary. So exercise equals poor man's immunotherapy.
Thank you, Jim. I'm getting up at 5 in the morning to ride up the mountain. I'm looking for a reason why, so I've got it now. Thank you.
Well, make sure you have a flashlight, John. It's dark at 5 in the morning.
I do have a flashlight. Yeah.
But so maybe instead of poor man's or immunotherapy, really, it's fit man and fit woman equals immunotherapy. Now, I'm not sure I can find an adequate segue between exercise and our next topic, which is medical cannabis. But anyway, I'll throw over to you, Jim. John's detailed some of the history and evidence that we have for exercise, and you've backed him up on that. Is there any evidence for the use of medical cannabis in treating cancer at present?
So there is evidence, and the evidence needs to be really clarified as to what area of cancer medicine we're looking at. For years, we've known that cannabis, cannabinoids, so cannabis derivatives, have been used to be very effective in treating vomiting, nausea, pain, anxiety. That is well and truly established. One of the things which isn't established yet from a clinical perspective is the effect that cannabis has on actually enhancing patient survival with various cancers. Now, yet again, going back to animal models, going back to those mice, there's definite evidence that cannabinoids can actually reduce tumours by influencing tumour blood vessel development, inhibiting the way that tumours spread to various other organs, increasing the rate of tumour cell death. That's been seen, but what we haven't quite seen yet is good, well-designed, randomized controlled trials where we're looking at various standard of care therapy plus standard of care plus cannabis to confirm that there is a definite survival advantage. Those trials are ongoing, but until those results come out, it's difficult to say that taking cannabis is certainly going to aid with your survival, certainly helping with other things which I've just mentioned there.
Right. Thank you, Jim. I mean, very topical, and I think that'll help people. We're having some excellent comments through the Facebook Live chat room, and please continue to send in your questions. Terry has mentioned about the importance of exercise again, and how in the UK certainly it's a very structured part of someone's care post-cancer diagnosis. Hazelin has mentioned that often when people are in hospital, it's very hard to exercise, and I think that's very true, Hazelin. And certainly I would put forward to anyone watching, if exercise hasn't been prescribed for you as a formal prescription, so to speak, certainly talk to your doctor, your oncologist, about the suitability for exercise and about whether it's appropriate for you to be referred to an exercise class or qualified exercise physiologist, because John and Jim have both very much highlighted the benefits of exercise. Now, clinical trials are being done around the world. Actually, the penetrance of clinical trials into clinical practice in Australia is relatively low. And some of you through the Facebook chat have mentioned that. I mean, enrolment into clinical trials is really only available for the minority of patients. And there are a lot of reasons for this, including, as John's alluded to, the expense and difficulty of running clinical trials. But one of our unique issues in Australia, of course, is geography. And a lot of people do live outside of capital cities. They live in regional cities, in rural areas, or even just on the outskirts of our main cities where transport into trial centres is difficult. Sophie, could you give us an idea of how do patients living in more remote and regional areas access clinical trials, and what are the options for these patients?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think one of the benefits that we will see from what's happened over the last 12 months with COVID is going to be a very positive change in direction, not just for clinical trials, but for patients who do live rurally and regionally, to be able to access medicine and medical experts that normally they would have to travel to. But focusing on clinical trials, there'd been a lot of work going on for many, many years around the use of telehealth in clinical trials. And what's really driven that forward, it has been COVID. And I think you'll start to see over the coming months some of the really good groups in Australia, so independent of ICON, but groups like COSA have put a huge amount of time and effort into developing a telehealth program for clinical trials. And as I said, COVID really helped to accelerate that. It's something here at ICON we are very actively exploring. In fact, one of our senior managers at ICON is very much involved in the Queensland telehealth program, and we're very excited to see that come forward and actually start to roll that out, particularly in Queensland. But I think also for us here at ICON, the focus for us for clinical trials, we already have a significant number of our cancer centres out in the rural places across Australia. And the research program is now actively following that. So we will be using things like telehealth. But as John said, as part of the introduction, we've also been looking at a lot of other IT and innovative ways that we can make sure that our patients who are being treated at an ICON centre away from the big metropolitan cities can still have access to clinical trials. So an example for us, I'm here in Hobart. We're literally just about to launch our clinical trial program here in Hobart, which is fantastic. It means that patients who may otherwise have had to travel to Victoria or other states, as we build that program, will actually be able to stay here in Hobart to be able to access those clinical trials. We've just launched a clinical trials program in Toowoomba last year. And at the very least for the next 3 to 4 months, we're looking at launching a clinical trials program in Cairns and in Townsville. So both of those are really exciting. And watch this space. We already deliver a huge amount of cancer treatments to patients as close to home as possible, and we will be doing the same for clinical trials. But for those people not ICON patients, the same thing is happening. A lot of the big public hospitals are really exploring options to use IT and IT innovations to bring more trials to patients so they no longer have to travel into the cities.
Fantastic, Sophie. Thank you. John, do you have anything to add around teletrials and this access issue?
Yeah, look, I think an important point to make, Ian, is that it's not so much the number of people who are on clinical trials, because there are many diseases where treatments are set, particularly in the early phase, I think what's important is that people have access when they need them, and that their cancer treatments setting, be it a cancer centre or an individual practitioner, is involved in a clinical trial program, because we know that improves the outcomes. Centres that are involved in clinical trials actively have better outcomes in terms of care. The quality of care is improved. And of course, all of us know that if you're involved in a clinical trial, there's a lot more paperwork, there's a lot more work to be done to clarify what's happening through the course of a treatment, and that improves care generally. And I think that's an important part of it. And that's why it's so critical, I think, to get trials out into rural and remote areas, because a number of cancer strategies have identified that the absence of clinical trials in the country does have an adverse effect on the quality of care. And so I think we certainly owe it to the whole country to broaden that access in the way that Sophie's spoken about, which I think is a work in progress at this point.
Sure. No, thank you, John. Now, we have some live questions I'll go to now. There's a few around specific diseases, and we'll try and deal with them fairly quickly, although, of course, it's a complex area. But before we go to some specific diseases, Kelly asked a very pertinent question around the phases 1, 2, and 3 of clinical trials, Jim. And how long does it take for a drug to enter phase 1 clinical trials, to go through those phases and become standard of care?
Well, excellent question. From the inception of phase 1, we could be talking, for that trial to be completed, we could be talking 3 years, 3 to 4 years. Phase 2, about the same. Phase 3, possibly about the same. So it could be up to 10 years before you see some of these drugs from inception, phase 1, to phase 3 being standard of care. And of course, you've got to think about all the regulatory processes which are associated with this. And there may be a phase 4 part to it as well, which is like a post-marketing exercise to check on various side effects noted in phase 3. So it can be some time.
Is that frustrating?
Very frustrating. If there's a way in which we can try and speed up these processes, especially the red tape which goes behind developing these studies, that would be absolutely fantastic. I know that there are various companies which we're associated with which are trying to develop ways and means of trying to streamline this. So 10 years is way too long.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the COVID vaccines have provided a model to some extent, haven't they? It's a sign of what you can do if you have to in a hurry. And that doesn't necessarily always make it the right approach, but I think the other component is new drugs that have looked really promising do get a push along, don't they? Yeah. And the immunotherapy drugs have really got a good push along, because it's evident that it's a big change.
Yeah, without doubt.
Sure. Sophie, radiotherapy and trials. Obviously, ICON has a lot of radiotherapy centres around the country. Are radiotherapy trials part of what you're supervising and part of the plan for the future?
Yeah, absolutely, Ian. So we have a really broad selection of clinical trials available to our patients, and they fall into 2 broad categories. So again, we like to partner with really strong groups in this space. So a lot of the trials that we do at ICON that are not designed by our own doctors are through groups like TROG, which is the Trans-Tasman Radiation Oncology Group. Again, they're an independent group, and you'll find a lot of trials with TROG run, and not just here in ICON, but lots of providers and hospitals that deliver radiotherapy. So we take part in a lot of those trials. But a very exciting part of what we do at ICON, we have a really extensive network of very highly skilled radiation oncologists. And they work to actually design and create their own clinical trials. Those trials come into my team, so they go through all of the same rigorous processes around how do we design the protocol, how do we make sure it's safe. We have independent people that will look at the protocol for us, still has to go through an independent ethics committee in exactly the same way all of the trials that we do have to go through. But we're really building on the doctor-designed trials at ICON. We have a person dedicated to that. They work full-time just to support those doctors create those trials and make sure they're run to really, really high standards. So we do a great mix of trials that are run by other big, important national groups here in Australia, and in fact, some groups outside of Australia, and our own trials that we design here.
We did have a question on the live chat, in particular with respect to androgen deprivation therapy in prostate cancer, and whether you knew, Sophie, if we were running any trials into the long-term effects of that treatment that's often coupled with or without radiation therapy.
I think I would like to go away and check. We have about 150 trials running at the moment, so I'd be very happy to check. And again, I think if there are any people on this thread asking specific questions, would really encourage you to either come and check our website or go and check one of the other websites that I mentioned earlier. They will be able to tell you all of the different trials that are being run for prostate. Yeah. Very happy to come back to that one, but I'd like to go away and check our list.
Sure. No, that is, yes, absolutely fine. Jim, Andrea asks about Keytruda, which is a trade name for one of the immunotherapy drugs, of course, whether we have trials or is it standard of care for Keytruda in colon cancer?
That's an excellent question, and thanks a lot for posing that, because there's been a recent landmark study looking at Keytruda, otherwise known as pembrolizumab. It's an immunotherapy which targets one of those proteins I mentioned earlier, which puts the brakes on anti-tumor immunity. So what we found actually in colon cancer is there have been some really disappointing results with the lion's share of colon cancers, because about 96% of them don't have a mutation in a particular set of genes which is responsible for the tumor repairing itself. So that's 4% of patients with metastatic colon cancer who could potentially gain the benefits from immunotherapy. So what we found, there was a trial called the Keynote 177 study, which looked at standard of care chemotherapy for patients who had first been diagnosed with metastatic colon cancer versus pembrolizumab. And what we actually found, and this was just specific for those patients who had that mutation in something called mismatch repair proteins, if you had that mutation, your time in remission, so something called your progression-free survival, was 16 months. If you had chemotherapy, 8 months. And this has absolutely been a game changer, to the point now that the drug company which makes Keytruda has actually made this an access program for patients with metastatic colon cancer. And I truly believe that this will be available on the PBS fairly soon.
Great story, Jim. It's just so many different advances to talk about. One of the many forms of cancer that are feared, but sarcoma, traditionally, I remember when I was a medical student, was always a very scary sort of cancer. There are many types of sarcoma, Ewing sarcoma, other sarcomas. John, could you maybe briefly go through some of the advances and touch on some of the current trials in sarcoma medicine?
It's an interesting and complicated question, because sarcoma has many, many diseases. And the big two, I think, that concern us a great deal are Ewing sarcoma and osteosarcoma in adolescents and young adults. And that, I think, is one that I often receive questions about. And we saw some really good results from big clinical trials that were done in Europe, the United Kingdom and United States through the 1980s and 1990s, that really changed the face of those diseases and went from being diseases where the death rate was 80% to the death rate going to 60 to 80%. Survival rate going from 60 to 80% depending upon the circumstances, and so that was a very major step forward. But there's still a very stubborn group of young people who develop drug-resistant sarcoma, and there's been a lot of work in those areas. It's fair to say that the immunotherapy area has been disappointing. And there are complex reasons around that, very much as Jim has explained in colonic cancer. And there've not been major breakthrough drugs, although there have been drugs that have improved people's survival. Obviously, when you're treating an 18-year-old, then cure is the aim. Interestingly, there are clinical trials that show if we diagnose people early, we improve their prognosis greatly. And so if there's a simple change that can be made, there's been a lot of emphasis put on early diagnosis, remembering to do an X-ray, remembering to do an MRI in youngsters who have lumps or pain, because they're often dismissed. And I think we can make a huge impact there. But look, it's an area of great activity. Because they're rare diseases doesn't mean the work's not being done. And having watched the whole story of cancer care, suddenly a drug will come along that changes the face. And I'm hopeful that in Ewing's and osteosarcoma we'll see that happen in the near future.
No, thank you, John. That's right. You need hope in cancer medicine. Now, Jim, it doesn't need me to introduce, of course, that COVID-19 has been the topic for the last 15 months, and certainly the question on a lot of people's minds at present is should they avail themselves of the current COVID-19 vaccination program that's on offer. If someone is about to enter a clinical trial, can they have a COVID-19 vaccination? Can you describe to us the interplay of trials and vaccination?
Sure. So there are a number of different sponsors for clinical trials which have varying opinions on this. But what's coming out now, these are various protocols which are coming out now, only just emerging actually within the last 4 or so weeks, whereby because it's a live vaccine, they're insisting that at least 4 weeks before a clinical trial is commenced, patients are actually able to have the vaccine. So it is acceptable to have the vaccine, but there's got to be quite a broad window of time before going on to the trial. Now, the question is what happens whilst you're on the trial? And again, that's a bit tricky because various trials have different frequencies of treatment. And there are a number of studies which I'm running at the moment where they're saying there needs to be a 2-week window from having your investigational product to having the COVID-19 vaccine. But there's various rulings, but the message is it is safe to have it at this present moment.
Right. No, thank you, Jim. It's I'm sure it won't be the final word on that topic, but it's an ongoing area. But I think John's comments earlier on in the evening really are very apposite about how clinical trial recruitment has continued through COVID and indeed has been very strong at ICON through this time.
I think we've had an important history with vaccination, and I think people need to be reassured that we're not doing anything that's hugely different with the new COVID vaccines. There's been a lot of talk about the messenger RNA vaccines, which are the newest, but there's a history of involvement with those vaccines in vaccine trials in cancer that dates back for 10 years. So this is not new stuff. The principles are the same. We know, and those of course involved in bone marrow transplant know that you can safely give vaccines, although the timing's important and understanding the limits are important. It's a safe thing to do. So I think people can feel reassured. The initial cautious response of some of the sponsoring companies around their clinical trials was simply that it was adequate caution at an early phase in a pandemic. But I think we'll see that revert back to the normal approaches, and I think people can feel very reassured. I know, I've seen so many of these trials come through, and I feel so confident in saying to people, your chance of surviving COVID is so much better, and your chance of getting a reaction is so small that this is a sensible thing to do, particularly if you have a family member with cancer. They, of course, they're at real risk if they get a serious infection. So protecting your family with a ring of steel, if you like, is very important. So clinical trials have told us all of that over the last 12 months.
Okay, thank you, John. We're coming towards the end of the hour session. So I'm just going to go around to our panel and ask them one final question each, and then we will sum up. As I go around to our panel for one final question each, I just take this opportunity to thank everyone for watching, for tuning in. Of course, a recording of tonight's Facebook Live session on clinical trials will be on the ICON website, and please share it with your friends and acquaintances. So, Sophie, for your final question of the evening, can you comment that what happens to a patient when they're on a clinical trial and the trial finishes, but in actual fact, the medication that the person is receiving has been very beneficial? Will the supply of that medication be cut off, or what will happen to the patient when that trial actually concludes?
That's a really good question, Ian, and it's actually very trial specific. So we always want to make sure that before a patient makes the decision to go into a trial, that we've given them that information. So for some of our trials, if our patients have had a really good response to their treatment and it's appropriate for them to continue receiving that treatment, because it won't always be, some treatments only last, say, for 6 months, but if you look at some of the treatments that go on, particularly if it's about keeping patients in a good remission, we should always be able to tell a patient at the beginning of the study whether or not they're able to stay, because I do think that's a very, very important decision that patients need to be aware of. For the majority of our trials, those patients should still be able to receive a treatment. And in fact, it is one of the questions that we will ask the pharmaceutical companies, particularly before we start a clinical trial. Will a patient who's receiving benefit be able to keep taking this medication? And I think for any patient considering taking part in a clinical trial, I think that's actually a really good question to ask your doctor. And that information should be available for you in writing, in the information that we will give you before you make a decision.
Thank you, Sophie. And of course, communication, such an important aspect of clinical trial participation, but also, of course, of medicine in general. So on that vein, Jim, how should a patient communicate with their oncologist, their treating doctor, if they're not actually offering a clinical trial? How could a patient deal with that situation?
Well, I'd like to think that most doctors would have in their mind any opportunity in the patient's journey to be offering a clinical trial. So I'd be thinking that the doctor may not be offering it for a variety of reasons. So there are very strict criteria for entering patients into a clinical trial. It may be a situation where the patient is just simply not well enough. It may be a situation where certain blood parameters would actually rule them out of being entered. There may be just simple things like the disease can't be measured properly on a CT scan. So I guess it's up to the patient themselves to take it upon themselves to ask the doctor, what are the reasons why I'm not potentially being offered a clinical trial? Again, if you're not satisfied with those reasons, the websites that we've actually mentioned already in this talk will give you a plethora of various choices, which may be tumor specific with regard to trials, which you can always have a look at and seek a referral if need be for a second opinion.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's very helpful. So to round off tonight's session, I will go back to John Bashford, ICON's Director of Research. John, could you maybe list out for people when you're seeing a patient for the first time, or when someone is first diagnosed with a cancer, which is obviously a stressful time, what are the sorts of things you go through with the patient? What should a patient be asking, and how does clinical research have a place in what is such a very stressful time?
That's a big question, Ian. It goes to the core of clinical care, and I think the most important thing that all of us as clinicians can do is to be translators for our patients. And I think the ability to explain in a way that people understand, in a way that's not frightening or confrontationist is really essential. I think people want to know what can be done, and no matter what the situation, that's ultimately what people are looking for. Sometimes you might have to tell that over a couple of consultations. Sometimes people want to know it straight up. So I think adapting to that is very important. What patients have a right to know is what they have, what their diagnosis is, what the prognosis is, and then what are the treatment options for them. And I think I would generally say, look, this is a situation where a clinical trial may well be in your best interests because they are available in this difficult circumstance, or you have something that is very treatable with a very standard, reliable method of treatment, and the chances are very high that you'll be cured. And if you're not, then we have those other options further down the track. So I think mapping out a pathway, a lot of talk about patient journey and having a journey book, a descriptor, but I think of it like a roadmap into the future. But I think at the beginning you build that trust by making it hopefully obvious that you have a sense of the roadmap and that you've been there before. But clinical trials play a really important part. I think knowing that people have options is so important.
No, thank you, John, and thank you to Sophie, Jim, and John for tonight. And of course, a big thank you to all of you tuning in and watching at home. On behalf of Icon Group and Icon Cancer Centres, I wish you the very best for your journey or your loved one's journey on this International Clinical Trials Day. It's been a real privilege to bring together such a great collection of speakers to hopefully advance oncological care and clinical trials. So thank you everyone at home, and good evening.